Welcome, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. Clerk, will you call the roll?
Corliss,
Here.
Halliburton,
Here.
Morales,
Here.
Nash,
Here.
Stead,
Here.
Willetts. 5 present, 1 absent.
Thank you. And we've got one item before our executive session on the agenda. Oh, Eric, welcome back. Eric's going to go through the capital fund, how it's planned, the kind of the whole process, similar to the how a park becomes a park presentation that we had, which I say because it just reminds me of that song when we were kids, How a Bill Becomes a Law. Eric, welcome.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor, members of the council. Yeah, we are going to do a capital fund overview. I'm going to do the first approximate third of the presentation. We'll hand it over to Sean, who will go over. Sean Wilson from Public Works is going to do a portion.
I just want to check, Council President Pro Tem, can you hear Eric? Great. Okay, you're good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And after Sean presents, Wendy Elstad will talk a little bit, and then I'll bring us home. For the objectives for this discussion, we really have a few. First and foremost, as the mayor mentioned, is just kind of doing an overview of the capital fund. What's included in it? How is it funded? Then we'll go into how does staff prepare recommendations that ultimately come before the city council for inclusion in the annual capital budget. And then we'll talk at the end a little bit about some of the funding challenges that we see within the capital fund and next steps in the budget process. So leading off with what is the capital fund? And we talk a lot about it as we go through the budget process. There'll be a separate discussion as part of our workshops. The capital fund is used to account for our major equipment, major repairs and maintenance, and then discrete capital projects that are associated with our general government services. The capital fund is primarily supported via tax resources within the general fund. And when we talk about those general government services, here's some examples of what we're talking about. Public safety, so any of those major equipment projects or major repairs and maintenance that pertain to police and fire, our Parks and Recreation Department, library, arts and history, and cultural facilities that they manage, planning and development services, as well as our internal service departments. We can think about finance, human resources, information technology, legal, and community engagement when we think about those. As for what's included, a little bit more detail. When we talk about whether it be capital projects, major equipment, or major repairs and maintenance, you'll sometimes hear us talk about the CIP or the capital improvement plan. And to qualify generally to have a project within the capital improvement plan, it's going to be something that is greater than $10,000 and significantly improves or extends the lifespan of an asset. Certain items within the capital fund are routine and predictable. So when we talk about major repairs and maintenance, for instance, we might have an annual allocation for a certain type of repair. But many of the expenses within the capital fund are less routine and predictable. And even those that are somewhat predictable, meaning that they're going to be recurring on a semi-regular basis, they can have meaningful variation on a year-over-year basis when it comes to budget. When we think about the functions that are supported within the capital fund, it's important to think that our enterprise funds, so our airport, our water renewal fund, geothermal and solid waste, are not accounted for within the capital fund, even though they do have capital projects. The capital projects for those funds are accounted for directly within those funds. There are 3 primary funding sources for the capital fund and the projects supported therein. The largest funding stream for the capital fund are transfers from the general fund. So we do an annual transfer as part of our adopted budget that is usually approximates 12 to 13 million dollars. And I can talk a little bit more about that because we've made some efforts to increase that transfer over time. And then we'll also oftentimes do one-time transfers, whether it be throughout the year or at the end of the year when we look at any unallocated resources when we close the books. The second category would be electric franchise fees. And then the third category is kind of a catch-all, project-specific outside funding. And you can think about development impact fees, which are accounted for within the fund, grants, philanthropic contributions, and things of that nature. One note is that projects are not necessarily always funded in the year that the revenue is received. There's not exactly a one-to-one relationship. So sometimes we might fund a project from fund balance, and that fund balance would be accumulated from resources that were received in prior years.
Madam Mayor.
Yeah.
Eric, why electric franchise fees? Like that seems to be an outlier there.
Yeah, council member, thank you for that question. The decision to dedicate electric franchise fees to this fund predates me. It's been a longstanding practice. I believe that it was identified as a funding stream that could go into this when we started receiving those fees.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So I'll do an overview of major equipment. And oftentimes in the budget document or in other settings, you'll hear us talk about MEQ, which would be our shorthand for major equipment. The primary category within our major equipment is fleet. So whether it be new vehicles or vehicle replacements. And when we think about the fleet, there are some obvious categories. You can think about police cars or fire engines or inspector vehicles. But then there's also things like you can see on this slide here, a picture of the Zamboni at Idaho Ice World, certain golf equipment or rolling stock that's associated with other facilities. Also within major equipment would be certain hardware within our information technology department. You might also think about things like scoreboards at our sports facilities that would run through this category. Thinking about our fleet, we have approximately 1,800 assets, approximately half of which are on-road vehicles. There's a good majority that are not on-road. And replacements are required and systematically evaluated to ensure safety and availability. So there is a very rigorous process that goes into determining when a particular asset needs to be replaced. They'll look at age, they'll look at utilization, they'll look at resale value. There's a whole kind of complex evaluation that goes into that. But it is really important that we replace vehicles in our fleet timely, because we'll also be thinking about maintenance costs and the cost of holding on to a vehicle for too long. On this slide, you can see kind of a historical overview of expenses within our major equipment category. And one of the themes that you'll be seeing throughout this presentation is that there's oftentimes a lot of variability on a year-over-year basis when it comes to expenses. And you can see on this category, two years, fiscal year 22 and 23, were quite a bit higher than the other 3 years. Numerous factors contributed to that. One of those would be fire engines, right? So fire engines are one of our more costly asset categories within major equipment. And when we have to replace those, you'll sometimes see a blip. And we will plan for those. We have a multi-year equipment plan, and those would be a good example of a purchase that we would need to save for over time. One other thing to think about when we talk about major equipment is that as the city expands and we add new assets, or we add new people, we have a one-time cost to buy the initial piece of equipment to support that need. But then also, the replacement costs over time, which gets factored into our overall capital planning. I'm going to now hand it over to Sean Wilson in Public Works to talk a little bit about major repairs and maintenance.
Mayor, council members. So my name is Sean Wilson. I work in Public Works. I'm the facilities manager. The next two categories to talk about are pretty near and dear to me. I have a team of about 30 folks, and this is kind of what we do, try to make things the best we can around the city. I did put a couple pictures here up because a lot of times MRM is very boring. And so this would be like the second floor of the restrooms at the downtown library. 40s plumbing, not as accessible as it should be. It's just a lot of those types of things. So MRM really represents kind of that category. Within, as far as our portfolio goes in Public Works, most of the MRM is parks or Public Works. So within my portfolio, we have probably about 50 buildings, 50, 55-ish, 800,000 square feet. So multiple fire stations, police stations, all the libraries, City Hall West, all those good things. Within parks, it's a lot more horizontal assets. It's a lot of pathways, green belts, parks, just your typical park. The reason, I guess two things on why MRM is super important for us is one, we can extend the life of our assets. So there's kind of two options: run something to failure, or you invest in it as you go to get more time out of it. So like the downtown library is a perfect example, 1940s building, still in pretty good shape. Just keep it going, get more life. And usually the business case shows that it's more, as far as a life cycle for an asset, it costs less to keep it moving than it does just to replace it, run to failure and replace. The other part that's really important for us in this category is maintaining staff and community level of service. So when we look at things like City Hall, it's like keeping all the teams working so we could serve our community. If you look at, say, the downtown library, it's like very community driven, and we want to make sure that we have a great place, a great level of service for our community members. And it is kind of citywide reinvestments. That's what I mentioned. We have about 50 to 55 buildings in my portfolio in Public Works. But we also have, it's a public safety, libraries, Parks and Rec, but it's kind of across the spectrum of city assets on why we invest in MRM. So kind of to follow up a little bit on what Eric said, it varies year to year. We try to have a steady distribution of MRM and project it. But like if you look at last year, even though we show it as library, it's in the Public Works portfolio, but the Board of Trustees, we have to break it out separate, but it's something that I need to maintain. But we made a really big push downtown to get that asset a little bit more up to speed. The other part is what we're seeing is as we add assets, and so like Fire Station 13 would be a good example. There's an ongoing cost with that. Sometimes we're replacing in kind, but as we add stuff, MRM will go up just because we have more square footage, and it just costs more to deal with the square footage. The other thing to note on that, impact fees are not an allowable funding source. So this isn't a growth. This is maintaining our existing assets, our existing portfolio. The other project within my team is delivering capital projects. So we deliver most of all the larger capital projects, and the three on here are kind of the big ones that are currently in the works right now. So it's the Warm Springs Grill and Golf, Fire Station 5, Fire Station 13, kind of the larger ones happening. But there are also plenty of other capital projects that we work on. So I don't know if everybody parked in the basement today and the fancy door goes up super fast, you know, which, yeah, I love those doors. But I'm an engineer, I nerd out on that. But security enhancements, just keeping City Hall a safe place. So there's a whole array. There's big ones, small ones. The other part of this, there's also capital projects that we can't see, like information technology. There's behind this. It's not just public works. There's a lot of behind the scenes investments that we make in capital to keep the city running. I wanted to go over capital project life cycle real quick because it really takes a lot to get a project from an idea to ribbon cutting and getting staff in it. Typically it starts with like strategic analysis, like where do we need fire stations, for example. Discovery phase, and that's where the programming comes in. You know, what does it look like? How big is it? How's it going to serve that part of the community? The more, I guess, simpler stuff is design and construction. That's where more in my wheelhouse. It's like, yeah, let's build it, or let's design it, let's build it. And it typically takes about a 7-year time frame, sometimes longer, 9 years. A quick example of this is like Fire Station 13. We started that a long time as development was happening within the Northwest. Late I don't know, 2018, 19, we started thinking about, okay, working with fire, you know, Public Works and fire, of course, teaming up on this. Looking at, okay, how do we get service out there and what does it look like? Starting to look for properties. In that case, we were knocking on doors because there was no properties. So we're trying to, you know, work with just some of the local landowners, see how they could help. Discovery phase, you know, during COVID, that was kind of our discovery phase time. And that is like, what is the scope of the project? How big is it? That's where we look for like opportunities to get like BPD in there. You know, can we team up with other things that are happening around the city? Design, and of course we had the groundbreaking just recently. So lots of years just to get to the point where we're starting to shovel dirt. And then construction. So late next year is probably the ribbon cutting when we get it. But so the capital project life cycle could take quite a bit to get through. Variability, this again is, so the chart here is adopted budget versus fiscal year. And because these are multi-year, and I think Eric mentioned that, we may adopt a very large budget and it takes, you know, 2 or 3 years to actually implement the budget. So on a year-to-year basis, you'll see a lot of variability in the capital projects and what's set for them. And with that, I'll take any questions and pass it on to Wendy Elstead.
Madam Mayor, members of the council. My name's Wendy Elistad. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm their citywide portfolio manager. And what that means is that across all 13 departments of the city, I'm the one that watches for our portfolio of projects to ensure that they're moving forward, that leaders have visibility on what the city is doing, and that staff has the support that they need. So as Sean mentioned, capital planning is not as simple as what do we want today? It takes a multi-year cycle to determine how to lay together strategic plans. Our strategic plans vary from facility master plans, which Sean exhibited showing the new fire stations, our technology roadmaps so that we ensure that our software and our systems and our tools are supporting our staff as well as our department strategic plans for growth across the city. And then of course, some of the more tactical things around fleet replacement. All of these different plans tie together to form our multi-year forecast of capital plan. At any given time, staff spends time evaluating some of the key considerations to determine what makes sense to bring forward to you for a recommendation at any given moment. So we look at the priorities that you give us as well as what the mayor's office guides us to. the expectations from our community, any health and safety considerations that we might need to take into account for any given moment, prioritizing our underserved areas across the city, and then overall financial considerations. All of this background information staff goes through every year, in particular this time of year. From January until April, staff is compiling all the information in our capital plans from all the different categories, and we are preparing to bring forth specific items to you for consideration for the annual budgeting cycle. Over the course of the next several months, you'll hear a lot about this. So the annual budgeting cycle has to bridge both short-term needs of now and the longer-term needs for the city at the capital level. Sometimes that means the budget proposals that we bring to you will leave balance behind in the capital fund because we are watching the needs at an out year. Sometimes it means we might bring forward a higher amount for capital in any given year. So all of these considerations for the capital plan get balanced every year at this time of year to be brought forward to you. To give you some context on what else is happening during this time of year, we are also looking at departmental needs that fit outside of the capital plan. So these are the things that the departments need to be brought forward. As Eric mentioned earlier, the capital fund is one source of funding that we build our annual process on. The enterprise funds and the rest of the general fund are the rest. And all of the projects in our portfolio get scored and judged against the same things so that as we're determining what makes sense to bring forward, we're looking at an equal amount of comparison between things like regulatory requirements, the condition of our assets. As Sean demonstrated with his photos, sometimes they're less exciting than other condition of our assets analysis. However, alignment to city goals and then considering the overall growth across the city are things that staff considers when bringing forward an annual budget to you for consideration. And finally, Madam Mayor, we appear to have a question from the phone.
Thank you. Sorry,
Thanks.
Madam Mayor, I would have been happy to wait too until you finish that.
Oh, no, you're good. Go ahead. Sorry, I
Okay.
didn't see your hand go up.
No problem. It just did. I just had a question, I guess, about like are multi-year plans impacted by political changes at the city, and have there been any challenges through that kind of planning? And I guess if there are changes in those multi-year plans, what happens to the funds at that point? Are they released back into the general fund or reapplied elsewhere? I wonder if that's ever been a consideration or an issue.
I'll jump in here first. I mean, ultimately, it's up to the council to determine whether or not those changes are made. To the one large change that was made was related to the library, when there was a lot of money set aside for the library, with myself and the council at the time, we redirected that into housing priorities, some parks, various different things that had also kind of fallen into a backlog and needed to be addressed. Typically, though, it is, I'd say in the time that I've been here, that's probably the one change. Because
Right.
ultimately, when parks are programmed, it means you're taking a park from one neighborhood for another. If the council starts making those changes like that, and the city's been loath to do that.
Great. Thank you, Mayor.
Madam Mayor, I don't have anything to add to that. Any considerations that would be adjusted would come, of course, to City Council. The final aspect of considering capital fund proposals that we would bring forward to you is our overall capacity within the city. So our city staff has a certain capacity for completing projects in any given year. In recent years, staff has spent a lot of effort trying to ensure that we commit and we bring forward proposals that can be met and are achievable. So ensuring that we have the proper staff hours, the skills, the capacity, as well as just the overall human resources necessary to complete the projects. All of these considerations get balanced and brought forward to you in the annual capital fund. I believe I'm handing it back to Eric.
Thank you, Wendy. Madam Mayor, members of the council. This chart shows the annual recurring revenues that come into the capital fund. When we talk about the recurring revenues, it's really two. It's the general fund transfers as well as those electric franchise fees. And this chart demonstrates kind of the cumulative revenue uh, received within the capital fund over time from fiscal year 20 to today. And between 2020 and 2024, those revenues totaled approximately $100 million. This slide shows what we would look like if we would have kept up with inflation. So the orange portion of this chart shows what the transfer would have needed to be if we were to grow our transfers or grow those franchise fees commensurate with inflation. And we would be looking at approximately 25% higher of revenues that would have been required. So in other words, there's a gap of approximately 25% in terms of keeping up with the revenue within this fund. There have been great efforts made to increase funding that comes into the capital fund. As I mentioned earlier, at the end of any given fiscal year, if there are any unallocated funds, one of the principal places that we would recommend to place those funds would be into the capital fund. As part of the fiscal year 2024 adopted budget, there was a recommendation brought forward that the council approved to increase the ongoing transfer from the general fund into the capital fund. So for fiscal year 2024 and 2025, the transfer was increased by approximately $500,000 and programmed $1 million thereafter. Even with that, you would still be seeing quite a bit of an inflationary gap. So as we look to develop recommendations for the fiscal year 2025 proposed budget, staff is evaluating opportunities and different scenarios to further address that funding gap through the form of additional revenues. Because there are significant capital needs across the organization, and we're seeing a significant cost increase within the major repairs and maintenance and major equipment categories. So looking ahead, and then we can certainly, stand for any questions that the council might have. Today our intention was to bring forward, kind of an overview of the capital fund. We'll be back in 2 weeks doing an overview of property taxes for the council. On May 24th, there's going to be a budget workshop where each of the departments will come and present to the council. And then the council will see capital fund recommendations specific to fiscal year 25 as part of the budget book that will be released on June 14th. After that, we'll go through another workshop in June, have our public hearing on July 16th, all leading up to the adoption of the budget on August 27th. With that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions that the council might have.
Madam Mayor. So I guess one question, one comment. I've been on council for 5 years now. You've been at this, how long have you been at the city, Eric?
About 8.5 years.
8.5 years. So I'm going to assume that over the course of time, we see years where we have our booms and busts. And this is sort of a year where we have a really high amount of inflation. We're trying to balance things out. And so what I think I'm hearing you say is that in this year, as we have this large inflation gap, there may be some years that we have to invest a little bit more on not doing huge capital projects, but making sure that we're really focused on some of those maintenance, repairs, and replacements. And this may be a year where it's going to be harder to do large investments in capital projects. Is that what kind of the trend that you're seeing for this year?
Madam Mayor, council member, to some degree. I think really the point that I was hoping to impress with this slide is that if you look at it, maybe zooming out a little bit, the challenges of inflation are really kind of undermining the ability to add significant projects on a prospective basis. Sean talked about how it may take multiple years. So I'm kind of thinking about this from a multi-year perspective. It would be very helpful to, try and identify additional funds to come into the capital fund to start chipping away at that gap.
Great, that's really helpful. And then a comment that I might just add for some context. In reference to that big major change that we did see between the library funds and housing, there was a lot of heartburn. I think when council made that last decision, but there was also a lot of complexity that went into it as well with some of the legislation that had passed that made it harder to use some of those library funds and an affordable housing crisis that we were experiencing as well. And so when the mayor's office and our finance team brought that forward, I think people considered that really, really well. And it was really rare for all of the council members who had been here for a long time and me as a new council member to have to make that decision. And so it did seem like a pretty rare circumstance that had some other situations going with it as well that kind of forced us into making that hard decision that one time. But I haven't experienced it a lot since.
Madam Mayor?
Yeah.
Eric, thank you so much. This is really good. Couple questions. Just wanted to clarify budget workshop number 1, May 24th. That's a Friday. Is that correct?
That should not be. I
It's
must have had
it's
the wrong
that
date on
Tuesday.
Clarify. Okay, great. And then just curious about surplus of major equipment and where those revenues go. Doesn't look like it's going back into capital fund. Is that I'm sure it's a drop in the bucket, but can you speak to what surplus looks like?
Absolutely. Councilmember, thank you for that question. They do find their way back into the capital fund. It's in comparison to the other funding streams, it's a pretty de minimis amount, but they do find their way back into the capital fund.
Further questions? All right. Thank you. And now we have an executive session.
Madam Mayor, I move that we go into executive session pursuant to Idaho Code Section 74-206-1D to consider records exempt from disclosure as provided in Chapter 1, Title 74 Idaho Code.
Second.
We have a motion and a second, clerk.
Stead,
Yes.
Corliss,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Morales,
Yes.
Nash.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
Right. We'll be back at 6.